In the much storied history of the Star Trek universe, there have been many, many villains. Many of them come and go episodically based on the circumstances on one or another alien planet and are never seen again. A few, like Harry Mudd, get at least 2 episodes, 3 if you count the cartoon, and many more appearances in sort of secondary canon. He was popular and sort of comic relief more than a villain. Khan, of course, returned as the Wrath of Khan, but the really lasting villains are the other large space-faring powers. The real competition to the Federation is in things like the Romulans, the Borg, the Klingons, the Cardassians, and my favorite, the bestest ever villains of all time in the Star Trek universe, the Dominion. I serve the Founders. Obedience brings victory, and victory is life. The Dominion are the perfect villains for the Star Trek universe. It is the first time that we got a villain that was exactly the foil of, the evil opposite, so to speak, in an in-universe way, of the Federation. The Dominion is multi-ethnic and inclusive, if we can use that term properly. They are a multi-species federation of a type in which, by Federation standards, everything has gone horribly, horribly wrong. Now, we know that the Klingons are an empire. They conquer people. But other than some episodes of Enterprise, we never really saw the people that they conquered. It was sort of an uncomfortable reminder of why are we now friends with these people in the 24th century and beyond. But also, we didn't see these people serving on their vessels, serving in their empire. They were not incorporated, in a sense. So they might be conquered and being governed, enslaved by the Klingons, but they're not incorporated within the empire, despite any statements to the contrary the Klingons might claim. So the Romulans also. The Romulans, other than secondary canon, where we see some in the comic books and elsewhere, we don't see species that they have conquered and enslaved. By the time of Star Trek Nemesis, we get the Remans, but the Remans as being native to that, what was a binary planetary system, at least described before Nemesis, of Romulus and Remus. That whole situation is unclear, but yes, they are an undesirable caste within the Empire, apparently kept segregated and used for various things. But that comes very late in the history when it appears in Nemesis. And they are part of the home system. We again don't get sectors of space conquered by the Romulans and see them enslaved on screen. So we get this idea of these various empires dominating various places. It isn't until the Cardassians, but with the withdrawal from Bajor happening soon after we meet the Cardassians and the Bajorans, we again don't get any clear indication of who else they might have ruled during this whole height of their military sort of conquest. And of course, just like everything else within Star Trek, the real beauty of it is the way it reflects human themes. All the bad guys represent something. The Klingons were originally sort of swarthy Eastern European communists. They even focus on how there's cameras everywhere in their culture. They spy on one another. They're clearly meant to be the Soviet Union. But by the time they get their foreheads, Star Trek the motion picture and after, we get much more of this barbarian sort of vibe. They call themselves an empire, but they are very much aggressive, savage, animalistic. They are all of those barbarian tendencies within civilized man. The Romulans, on the other hand, this is particularly coy the way this is done. They look like Vulcans who are logical, who we've already learned to trust and who are part of the Federation. They're related to them somehow, but they are also really a reflection of that human theme. They're the deviousness, where the Klingon is the uncivilized savage, the Romulan is the civilized savage, the one that is devious, that is crafty, that is intelligent, that is plotting, is the part of you that plots to do evil, even against your own better judgment and conscience. The Cardassians are interesting as they come in later in Star Trek The Next Generation and after, but they are very much an unbridled militarism, and a particular type of militarism in response to, they describe the starvation and the plight of their people suffering to make it. They're in imperialism, not in the sense of barbarism, not in the sense of deviousness, but in the sense of, for practical reasons, they decide to become sort of a mercantile empire and change the fortunes of their people. But it is a military junta with this whole weird breakdown of how it works from a social sciences standpoint, where the military really governs and there's a civilian government sort of, but it doesn't have authority over military matters. And really, as a former political science major, I find it all very fascinating. So you have the barbarians, you have the devious schemers, you got the military government junta. The Borg are the full-on communists now with the Next Generation era, completely identityless. Their only identity is within the collective, thinking the same thoughts, literally under control and domination of the internet, if that wasn't very prescient. The Dominion is uniquely like the Federation. The Federation is made up of all sorts of different religions living in harmony. In the Dominion, there's one. In the Dominion, your rulers, the founders, are gods. Gods that are physical and material that you could touch. Now, over time, when we first met the Dominion, we learned that hardly anybody knew what a founder was or had seen that they were like a legend. And yet, as the series progresses, we see them walking around all the time and doing stuff and interacting with their underlings. Of course, it is a handful of their underlings. They maintain this semi-divine detachment and breed this religion into their Vorta and their Jem'Hadar servants. The Vorta are a perfect example of how this has gone awry. They were rewarded for their loyalty, for their generosity and kindness to a wounded founder in an archaic mythological time period that we don't get any clear reference to. Because of their kindness, they were elevated. Using genetic engineering, the Vorta were made better, smarter, larger, but then they're incorporated into the Dominion in this way that the founders mean to pay them tribute, but they're absolutely not free in any sense of the word. They can't reproduce naturally. They can only taste certain foods. They are the victims, living victims of their creator's nostalgia for that one episode in their past. The Jem'Hadar, from what we can gather, are made out of many different species. They are genetically engineered out of nothing. Well, out of other stolen genetic material, so not like ex nihilo, out of nothing. And yet the claims of the founders to be their god seem to ring more true to them for the reason that they're genetically engineered thoughts and behaviors, but also because they were literally created by the founders. So instead of a system of all these different religions learning to live together in harmony, you have a system where there is one religion. And people of different species are being incorporated into this multi-ethnic, multi-species sort of alliance, federation, or dominion, pick a term, and yet not as free people, but as totally manipulated raw material. And in that regard, the founders desire to use these other beings for their own good is excused to themselves as some sort of generosity or mercy, but it really is elevating the founder and putting all of these barriers between them and the barbarians, as they see it, that might roam their quadrant. So whereas the Federation is an alliance, a willing, voluntary alliance of free people, the Dominion is a completely dominated from the founders' sense of their own deity on down. However, it is not like we imagine other empires. If we use the Cardassians as an example, their control of Bajor was to strip it of natural resources, exploit those resources and the people there, use them as slaves, use them as sex slaves, simply sucking it dry. But when we meet other species within the Dominion, most importantly, we meet the Karma. We hear about them more probably than anyone else after the Jem'Hadar, the Vorta, the founders. The Karma, who have a business arrangement with Quark to sell Tulaberry wine, they, by all accounts, what we can gather from what appears on screen, they basically live free. The Karma run their own affairs. They know very little about the Dominion. For them, the founders are a legend, a myth, All they know is that when the Vorta tell you to do something, you do it. Otherwise, they send in the Jem'Hadar, which indicates there's no Jem'Hadar garrison on the Karma homeworld. There's no Vorta that just hang out there, although maybe there's some that advise the government. It isn't really clear. The Karma are able to do business with whom they choose, and they're able to carry on with their lives, as long as their interests don't contradict the Dominion's interests. See, as part of the Dominion, they are essentially controlled in their foreign policy and their economic policy as necessary, but their domestic life seems to be pretty much theirs. It's a lot like the Bonapartist system, Napoleon's continental system, where as a monarch of a small region in Europe, you pledge loyalty to the emperor, he'll demand tribute, he might ask for some men to fight in his war, but as long as you're obeying the mercantile system and not doing business with Britain, you're essentially left alone as long as you don't stir up any trouble. So the Dominion isn't even really, it's rightly named, it isn't really an empire, even though there are beings they have exploited for their own benefit, creating the Jem'Hadar, using the Vorta. But many species, we would presume, like the Karma, are left to their own devices unless, for some reason, their interests contradict the founders' interests. So again, in every respect, exactly the opposite of the Federation, not working for a collective common good for all, but even the degree to which these different worlds have freedom, it's independent of one another, it's in their small locale, while everything above that, foreign policy, if you will, is dominated entirely by the Dominion, and not with free people. So when you have this multi-ethnic, multi-species state, just like the Federation, but within the Federation, people have a say, people have feedback, you listen to other opinions. In the Dominion, there's one way. And so the unity is completely enforced, and it is completely top down, but it is completely tyrannical over and against the Federation with its ideals of freedom. And so the Dominion, perfect foils, perfect opposites, perfect bad guy. They are the Federation, but they're the Federation when everything happened the wrong way.